We welcome you to Wheeling Jesuit on our Founders Day, our 60th anniversary. My name is Jamie Brogan. I'm the Director of Campus Ministry and Mission and Identity here. Our new Senior Vice President for Mission and Ministry, Father Bill Ripple, is this evening, or hopefully by now, in Mexico with our doctoral students in physical therapy on a service immersion trip. So it is my pleasure in his stead to welcome you to our lecture. Tonight, the Department of Theology and Religious Studies and the Office of Mission and Identity are proud to present The Jesuits Are Still at It, 200 Years of Restoration and Renewal, 1814 to 2014. And this is a lecture by Father John Padberg, and it commemorates the 200-year anniversary of the restoration of the Society of Jesus. After the lecture, we will have some time for your questions, and then I invite you to continue the conversation out in the vestibule where we have a light reception. I now welcome Father Mike Steltenkamp, Professor of Religious Studies at Wheeling Jesuit, to introduce Father Padberg.
I'd first of all like to thank Dean Rob Phillips and Board of Director Trustee Ed Schmidt for wearing a red tie along with me tonight. I wear this once a year. It has WJU on it, and it's our birthday, so why not wear the WJU tie? Really honored to be able to present our speaker tonight, Father John Padberg. Let me cite a few of the details of his background. John has been director of the Institute of Jesuit Sources since 1986. He comes to us from St. Louis University. He's also served as the rector of the Jesuit community at St. Louis U, professor of history, and academic vice president of St. Louis University, member of the staff of the Jesuit Conference headquarters of the Society of Jesus in the United States, and president of the Weston School of Theology in Cambridge, Massachusetts. For 16 years, he was chairman of the Seminar on Jesuit Spirituality and editor of the Studies in the Spirituality of Jesuits. His doctorate studies in intellectual history and the history of ideas were done at Harvard University. His current research and writing center around the history of the Society of Jesus. Among his works are Colleges in Controversy, the Jesuit Schools in France from Revival to Suppression, 1815 to 1880. Together as a companionship, a history of the 31st through 33rd General Congregations of the Society of Jesus, as author and co-editor for Matters of Greater Moment, a history and translation of the decrees of the first 30 Jesuit General Congregations, 1558 to 1957, and as editor, Jesuit Life and Jesuit Missions Today, a translation of the documents of the 31st through 35th General Congregations. Father Padberg has an incredibly distinguished career, but we Jesuits who know him as a great man, brother in Christ, someone that we are really proud to have in our ranks. And knowing of him as a person and his scholarly career, I am just really honored to say, welcome to this fine man, Father John Padberg.
In August 1816, just 2 years after the restoration of the Society of Jesus, John Adams, our second president, wrote to Thomas Jefferson, our third president. Let me quote. "I do not like the late resurrection of the Jesuits. Shall we not have swarms of them here, in as many shapes and disguises as ever a king of gypsies himself assumed?" Jefferson wrote back later, "Oh, I dislike with you their restoration, because it makes a retrograde step from light to darkness." Adams also mentioned nicely, "Given our system of religious liberty in this country, we might be obliged to offer them an asylum, but if they do not put the purity of our elections to a severe trial, it will be a wonder." And you can understand why, because, again, as Adam says, quotations, if any congregation of men could merit eternal perdition on earth and in hell, it is this company of Loyola. Well, now that we've set the scene for what we're going to be doing, what I'd like to do this evening is talk about the the restoration of the Society of Jesus and its revival, in a sense, its renewal after Vatican II. That's an awful lot of space to cover, and I'm not sure we're going to get to it. But before we can get to the restoration of the society, we should know something about the suppression. So on the early evening in August, somewhere August, well, other August seems to be a fateful month for the Jesuits. August 16, 1773, a papal functionary came to the Jesuit headquarters in Rome, asked for the general and his assistants, and then read out the basic parts. It's a document that goes on page after page after page, but read out the central part of the decree of suppression of the Society of Jesus. In it, the words of the document says itself. The Pope said, quotations, "In the fullness of apostolic power, we put out of existence and suppress the Society of Jesus. We do away with and abrogate each and every one of its offices, ministries, works, houses, colleges, in whatsoever land they exist, as well as its statutes, usages, customs, decrees, and constitutions." And as if that isn't enough, it goes on, "and we declare perpetually abolished and entirely distinguished all authority of the superior general and of provincials and visitors and any superiors of any kind in the Society of Jesus." That seems to be fairly definitive, one might say. What brought this on? Well, without going into the whole suppression, in 1773, there were about 15 years before in which a perfect storm of nationalism in the countries of Europe, the Catholic countries of Europe especially, the decision that the king and the country were going to run the church in their own land, in everything, maybe except for dogma, but everything down to the number of candles they could have on an altar. Frederick the Great called the Emperor Joseph the sacristan emperor, because he did decree how many candles you could have for Mass. Nationalism, the countries were going to decide on how the church was to run, and the Society of Jesus as an international order was somewhat, in their minds, an obstacle to that. Secondly, that was that was true in Portugal, France, Spain, Naples. Secondly, the perfect storm of the philosophes, as they called them, in 18th century France, who were determined that nature and reason alone should govern the lives of men and women. And after all, everybody knows that the Society of Jesus is in the service of a supernatural organization, and God knows it doesn't have reason in its mind, it's superstition, that's all. That's the people who took at us from that side because we were too retrograde. On the other side in France were the philosophes, the people who were the proponents of nature and reason, Voltaire and Diderot and people like that, who maintained the best thing that could happen for the progress of the human race was to get rid of us. And on the other side, the Jansenists, a very, very rigorously conservative group within the Roman Catholic Church that were convinced that the Society of Jesus was destroying the church by being far too lax in the way it preached and taught and heard confessions. As someone said, it made it easy for Christians to go to heaven on feather beds. That's on either side of that. And then, quite frankly, within Spain, where the society had started, the king became persuaded that the society was his personal enemy. Why he did is still a question to be investigated by historians. If any of you want to get into something like that, I assure you you'll find plenty of documentation in the archives in Spain. And then, to be perfectly honest, there were certainly a group of people, highly placed people in the Curia, that is the Vatican offices, who were thoroughly opposed to the Society of Jesus. They too thought we were very laxist, fostering superstition, fostering idolatry, for example, in the way in which we said that in China, to take only one instance, the veneration of Confucius and the veneration of ancestors were cultural phenomena. They were not religious rites. They were not superstition and idolatry. Pardon me. The Holy See at one point decided they were and forbade the Chinese rites until they reversed themselves 200 and some years later in the early 20th century. But those were the background for the suppression of the society. They were pitched out of Portugal in 1759, all of them hauled onto boats on the Tagus River, shipped across the Mediterranean and dumped on the Papal States without even asking or informing the Pope. In 1764, they were abolished in France, but at least the French did not have them thrown out of the country as such. They could stay there, but they could not teach. All of their schools and all of that was abolished. In Spain in 1767, within 4 days, March 31st and April 3rd, all 1,200 Jesuits in Spain were on the road, thrown out of their houses, taken to the nearest port in the south of Spain, and again put on ships and dumped on the Papal States. That was from 1759 to 1772. 1772, as the great bell in St. Peter's tolled very lugubriously one evening, two clerics walking across the Piazza San Pietro, one remarked to the other, because they knew that Clement XIII, the Pope, was seriously ill. "Ah, that signals that the Pope has died." And the other man said, "Oh, no. That simply means the last sacraments are being brought to the Society of Jesus." Clement XIII had been an ardent supporter of the society and refused to do anything toward the suppression which these various kings had asked for. We have to put ourselves in a very different set of circumstances. Whatever we think of the present government, Republican or Democrat, nobody says that the President of the United States is going to occupy himself day in and day out with relationships with the Vatican, and especially with the suppression of a religious order like the Society of Jesus. But the church and state were inextricably linked at the time, and that was a perfectly ordinary kind of thing to do. What kind of things supposedly were the Jesuits guilty of? Well, this is an excerpt from the decree of the Parlement of Paris, 1764, giving reasons for the outlawing of the Society of Jesus in France. The society called the Company of Jesus inadmissible in any civilized society, contrary to natural laws, subversive of all authority, whose essence is a continual activity in order to gain independence and then absolute power. The society is guilty of simony, blasphemy, sacrilege, magic, witchcraft, astrology, irreligion, idolatry, superstition, immodesty, theft, parricide, homicide, suicide, and regicide. You can't do much better than that. I don't know what the Jesuits were doing with all of their time. Their doctrines have at all times been favorable to the schism of the Greeks, subversive of the dogma of the procession of the Holy Spirit, favoring the Lutherans and the Calvinists, insulting to the fathers of the church, to the apostles, to Abraham, to the prophets, to St. John the Baptist, and to the angels, teaching men to live as beasts and Christians to live as pagans, stifling even in parents and children all feelings of humanity, contrary to the maxims of the gospel and the examples of Jesus Christ, doctrines whose poison is so fearful and so well attested by their sacrilegious efforts, they cannot be viewed without horror. Well, as I said, if they were involved, and by the way, that is only about 10 lines of single space on this page, and this is only an excerpt. So you might see why some people thought the society ought to be suppressed. Clement XIII died. A papal conclave took place in 1773, in which, at that time, by the way, if you go to a conclave now to elect a pope, only the cardinals go into the actual voting. And they may not bring with them into the house where they live, and so on, anybody but themselves. But back at this time, since cardinals were supposedly nobility, they could bring several servants with them. And those servants were bribed up to the eyeballs by the various courts to try to figure out what was going on, who was on whose side, and so on and so on, despite the fact they had taken promises they would not do that. In the conclave, there were three groups. First, one group that certainly was utterly opposed to the Society of Jesus and wanted to get it suppressed. Another group of cardinals that would never vote for that and were favorable to the society. And a middle group, neither favorable or unfavorable, but concerned about the church as such. That middle group, it had to be very careful that the ones who wanted the society suppressed and got an election of a pope favorable to that would not seem to be bribing any of the cardinals to vote that way. Because to do that in a papal election is the sin of simony. In other words, exchanging a spiritual good for a temporal, a timely favor. And that invalidates any papal election. They wanted a duly elected pope. So after working back and forth on that, they finally came close to electing the person I will mention in a moment. But there's a story too good not to tell. Cardinal Berni, who was one of the state cardinals. Do you ever hear of state cardinals? No, we don't have those today. We have, pardon me, curial cardinals, that is, cardinals who work in the curia in Rome, and we have residential cardinals, you know, the cardinal archbishop of this, that, or the other city. A state cardinal in the 18th century was one whom the Holy See had to appoint, kings insisted, as a cardinal to foster the welfare of the state, not the church, but the welfare of the state in that particular country, in the eyes of the church. Cardinal Berni was the state cardinal for France. He was pushing with two other cardinals to vote for at least to consider the suppression of the society. He took a very strong line, pushed, and the two other cardinals, both named Albani, one an uncle and the other a nephew, a distinguished papal family from way back. The elder Albani pushed back and said, "Do not take so pushing a line with us." And Berni responded in response, "Oh, your eminences, please do not take that kind of a line with me either. After all, here we are all gentlemen here in the conclave. We are all of the same cardinalatial dignity." The elder Albani, he's about 80 years old, reached up and took off his biretta, that hat that the clergy wore, and with a quivering hand and a quavering voice, looked at Berni and said, "Oh no, your eminence, we are not all of the same cardinalatial dignity. I did not get this scarlet biretta by being the houseboy for the whore of France." And everybody knew that Bernice had gotten his job as cardinal at the instigation of the favorite of the whore, the mistress of the King of France, Madame de Pompadour. So you can see how things work so nicely. In case you ever begin to think there are problems in the church today, please, there are not. I assure you they are not. Okay. Finally, Lorenzo Ganganelli, a Franciscan, was elected pope. He took the name Clement XIV, and then for the next 4 years, from 1774 until 1769 to 73, he was bullied by the representatives of the countries that wanted the society suppressed universally. Naples, France, Spain, and Portugal, with threats. For example, if you don't suppress the society, we will throw all the other religious orders in our country out. That's a pretty serious question. Finally, the one delegate especially pushed with Clement and threatened, at least intimated, if you do not suppress the society, we'll take the church into schism. That is, we'll take it out, the church in our country, out of relationship to and with Catholic Church. Just as, for example, in the time of Henry VIII, the English church went into schism out of relationship with the Catholic Church. And the last thing the Pope wanted was for that kind of thing to happen. So finally, with great push, they succeeded in getting him to do what I said, to perpetually abolish and entirely extinguish the Society of Jesus universally in 1773. Well, that's the end of the story, and I can leave now. But something happened that nobody could possibly have foreseen. If you try to push what I'm going to say now as a movie script or a TV program, you would be told, hey, it lacks all verisimilitude. It could not have happened this way. 1 year before the suppression, 1772, Russia and Austria and Prussia had carved out pieces of Poland and taken them for their own lands. Russia got about 2 million, out of that they got about 2 million Catholics, they got about 200 Jesuits. Jesuits are Catholics, by the way, we don't distinguish. And a whole series of Jesuit schools, which were, by any intimation, the best schools in the empire. They also had a ruler whose will brooked no opposition. She wanted, Catherine the Great, wanted to keep the society alive there. She wanted to thumb her nose at the other kings and princes who weren't going to tell her what she was going to do in her land, and she certainly was not about to do anything that the Pope necessarily suggested. So, with the document that suppressed the society, there was a second document from the papacy, from the Holy See, that set out how that document, the abolition, was to be promulgated. In other words, was to be published, how it was to go into effect. How does a law go into effect in the United States after it's passed by Congress? When does it go into effect? When the president signs it? No. When does it really go into effect? When it appears in the Federal Register. Because, you know, for all of these laws, there are a whole series of regulations that have to be written for the way in which they're put into effect. Well, back here for the suppression of the society, to try to keep the property of the Jesuits out of the hands of the kings who were just waiting with greedy little fingers, that second document said the suppression took effect only when, in each diocese where there was a community of the society, like here at Wheeling Jesuit, when the bishop of that diocese formally published the decree. So if it wasn't published, it didn't take effect. Well, the bishops around the world, following the wishes of the Pope, some reluctantly, some eagerly, but they all did so. Catherine said no. The year before, she had decided to put all the Latin Catholics, contrary to difference from the Russian Orthodoxes, she had decided to put them all into one Catholic diocese, which she herself established, and appointed an archbishop. He was an auxiliary bishop at the time. She appointed him the bishop of the diocese without informing or asking the Pope for any permission of any kind to do that. Well, she was not about to allow the Society of Jesus to be suppressed in her own lands. What then happens? There were 200 Jesuits up there. There was one superior, Father Czerniewicz was his name, a great hero to my mind. He and Father Pignatelli, who was the patron of this school, who was canonized in 1954 when the school was founded. Those two are, in some senses, the saviors of the society. Pignatelli, who kept these dispersed Jesuits, now no longer Jesuits, together, Spanish and Portuguese, in northern Italy, providing sustenance and support through rich friends and relatives for many years, trying to keep them into community of some kind, keeping them with some sense of what the society was. But they were not Jesuits. But here's Czerniewicz, this man up in Poland. What do we do? What shall we do? He writes to Catherine, and she says, no. He says, look, the Pope says we're supposed to be suppressed. She wrote back to him and effectively told him he had a tender conscience and she would be happy to be his moral advisor. Wouldn't you like that? So then the superior up there wrote to the nearest papal nuncio who was in Warsaw and said, what do we do? The nuncio wrote back and said, it's perfectly obvious what you do. You're Christians, you're Catholics, you're priests, you're Jesuits, members of the Society of Jesus. The Pope said you're suppressed, therefore. On the other hand, everyone with any intelligence knows that there is divine law and positive law. And divine law binds semper ubique, always and in every circumstance. Natural law binds when nature comes into play in whatever the case is, and positive law binds always and everywhere, except where it's impossible. Therefore, ladies and gentlemen, that is known as posterior protection. You know what the more usual term is. Well, there they were, and they didn't know what they were supposed to do and how they were supposed to do anything at all. So, gradually, Catherine sent finally a representative down to Rome. By the way, Clement XIV died the year after the suppression, supposedly poisoned by the Jesuits, according to their opponents. He wasn't, I assure you. We're really not that good. But he died. The next pope was Pius VI was certainly interested in trying to revive the society, but there's no way he could do that with the king still in place and insistent that nothing be done to restore the society. Catherine finally sent her envoy to Rome to give some sense of what was going on, and the poor harried provincial up there in Poland sent a letter along for the papal secretary of state and said, could you please give us some sense of who are we, what are we supposed to do? And the answer that came back was a masterpiece of papal diplomacy. Let me say it in Latin first. I think it's Praecum tuarum exitus ut exoptas et auguro felix. May the result of your ardent prayers, as you sincerely desire, and as I foresee, be a happy one. You could translate and parse that in any way you wanted. And he kept himself in the good graces of the king. I didn't say they could be restored, but that was enough to get them going. Czerniewicz told Catherine, if we're going to continue up here, we've got to have a novitiate, a place where the young Jesuits begin their course. We've got to have a general meeting of the Jesuits to get some authority up here. I've got no authority other than what I was given before the suppression. We've got to have those two things. And we have to get some kind of papal okay. Well, Catherine says, start building. And then she tells Rome that she's starting a novitiate up there. They held a general congregation. They elect Czerniewicz as sort of vicar general while they're up there. And things go on merrily that way. And they would have continued that way if, again, a totally unforeseen thing did not happen. 1789, 16 years after the suppression, the French Revolution came along. And it simply, remember, that didn't occur just in France, like Tale of Two Cities, where the guillotine keeps chopping people's heads off. It went all the way from Spain, all the way through Europe, all the way up into Russia itself in its effects. Guillotine. Do you know who that's named after? Joseph Guillotin, Guillotin. The E on the end of it is for guillotine. Joseph Guillotin was a Jesuit. Well, pardon me, he didn't invent it, he perfected the guillotine. After the suppression of the society, he was no longer a Jesuit. He had been a scholastic. He became a doctor, and he was very interested in crime and punishment, and decent punishments for a crime that would inflict a penalty without inflicting pain. Before that, if you chop people's heads off, they used an axe, which was not very good. The guillotine, he called it a philosophical instrument, which the miscreant, that is the guilty one, the only thing he experiences when he is put to death is a slight, cool whisper on the back of the neck. I would not suggest you try that, but nobody has really said that's all they experience. But in any case, the French Revolution swept away the old order. It swept away much more than just that. But after the whole of the revolution, I could go on for an hour on that and what it did to the church and the society. In 1814, Pius VII, who had been taken as prisoner by Napoleon and in France for some years, went back to Rome and decided that immediately, if at all possible, he was going to restore. He came back to Rome in May 1814 and restored the society in August 1814. What was the church like in which the society was supposed to be at its service? It was an extraordinarily conservative church. Why wouldn't it be? If you had been a Christian and you had seen in the name of the revolution, you had seen in the name of liberty, equality, fraternity, democracy, if you had seen priests killed, nuns raped, churches burned, schools closed, Christians exiled, would you have been in favor of liberty, equality, fraternity? Not at all. And certainly the ruling group in the church was desperately against it. If you had been a Jesuit when you were restored on August 7th, you certainly would not have been in favor of them, and you were going to be at the service of a conservative church, a very small group of people who barely got the society going again. It wasn't at all sure that they ever would exist. On August 7th, at the Church of the Jesuits, Pius VII said Mass, then they went to the building next door, the curia, the old curia of the society, and they read the letter of restoration, which was much shorter than the letter of suppression. And the most important phrase in it was, having abrogated the document of our esteemed predecessor, Clement XIV. In other words, it's out. That's the way we got restored. But there were at the most 600 Jesuits, somewhere scattered around the world by that time, some even in the United States, because there had been a partial restoration. The Pope had made clear that people who were not in Russia, but wanted to join the society, could join if they were accepted by the Russians, and they didn't have to stay there necessarily. For example, in this country in 1805, there was a group of Maryland Jesuits, 6, I believe, who did come back into the society, 2 who did not wish to, and 2 who could not because at the time they were the first bishop, Catholic bishop in the United States, John Carroll, and his auxiliary, Bishop Neal. But we started off from absolute scratch. In the 19th century, that was even more anti-clerical in many ways than the 18th century had been, and which had the wildest stories about the Jesuits themselves and what they were going to do and how they were going to be doing it. The society came back, as I said, in a very, very conservative kind of situation. And in many ways, however, not as bad or not as conservative in, say, the 20th century as it was in 1815 or 1850. The church, as an experience of the revolution, and the society in many ways too, had the reputation through most of the 19th century of being pretty much against most of what was going on in the modern world. If you contrast the way in which our present Pope, Pope Francis, speaks about the world and the way in which he acts and the way in which he says, God loves everyone. God loves you if you're a sinner. God even loves the atheist. You compare that with the way in which the Holy See, the popes, talk about the people who in the blindness of their hearts have resisted our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ and will have only the condign punishment that they should have. That's a different world that you're existing in. Where did the society, or what did the society do when it came back into existence with the Restoration? Jesuits are supposed to, whether they always do it or not is another question. Jesuits are supposed to be at the service of the church, not just the Pope, the bishops, the priests, the faithful, the ordinary person. What did people want their society to do at the Restoration? Overwhelmingly, first, there were about four things. Overwhelmingly, schools. The Society of Jesus, before the suppression, had about 22,000 members. At the Restoration, it had about 600. Before the suppression, it had something like 750 schools all over the world, from Krakow in Poland to Cuzco in Peru, educating most of the people who got beyond primary education for several hundred years. Overwhelmingly, the bishops asked for schools to be started. The pious faithful, ordinary people asked for it. The popes wanted them to get schools started also. That's one of the reasons, not the only one, why very rapidly the Jesuits got back into schools. That's the first thing they wanted. Secondly, there had been almost a complete lack of public manifestation of the faith in many of the lands touched by the Revolution. And parish missions were the second thing that they wanted people to do. Get people, the ordinary person not going to a Jesuit school, to get some understanding of the faith, what it means for you, what it can do for you in your relationship with God. Parish missions were extraordinarily popular. Thirdly, the Jesuits were the largest missionary organization in the church, what we call the foreign missions at one time. With the suppression of the society, those places simply vanished, most of them. And the Revolution made it impossible for anybody else from Europe, and that was where most of the missionaries came from, to go anywhere to the missions. So with the restoration of the society, that was the third big thing that we did indeed get involved with. And the fourth of them, which has had much more of a recrudescence, much more of a high profile in recent years, has the giving of the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius and Jesuit or Ignatian spirituality made available to everybody, ordinary lay people, laymen, laywomen, religious, priests, etc., etc. Those four things basically have had defined what the society was about in the 19th century, up through most of the 19th century, except the one place where we were not nearly as conservative as we were in Europe, and that's where the society was refounded and where most of the members came from for a long time. The one place where we were not nearly so conservative was that crazy, wild, far distant, absolutely inexplicable missionary territory called the United States. Yes, yes, we were a missionary territory, unquestionably so. When the Jesuits came back into the society here in 1805, and when the Jesuits came, for example, to where I'm from, St. Louis, to Missouri, in 1823, to probably the first foreign, St. Louis, the first foreign mission that this society had had since its restoration, they started from scratch. They didn't have the experience, first of all, they didn't have the experience of the French Revolution. So they didn't have that terrible reaction against all of those excesses. They had, increasingly through the 19th century, huge groups of immigrants, our ancestors that came to this country. And quite frankly, most of our ancestors were poor and illiterate. And the church was the main instrument for Catholics in this country through all of the 19th century to rise in the socio-economic scheme, to get education. And it was the church that provided most of the social services in this country through much of the 19th century. It was the Jesuits who, starting the schools here, couldn't run them the way they did in Europe. First of all, most people didn't want boarding schools here? And secondly, how were the schools supported in the old society? You will be surprised to know, I don't know whether I should say this given the presence of the president of the institution here, you will be surprised to know that it is formally forbidden in the constitutions of the society to charge tuition. I leave him to your tender mercies. Well, what happened on that? It became perfectly clear that we were not going to have princes and dukes and kings and city corporations and bishops found schools. The schools in the old society were endowed. They were endowed, and none of the students paid tuition. Whether you were the son of a pauper or the son of a prince, you did not pay tuition in the Jesuit schools. If it was a boarding school, you might pay there for the boarding, but not the tuition. What happened here? One of the schools that got started in this country, it became perfectly clear that there was no way in which it was going to survive. It was on the frontier, one of the frontiers, unless they could charge tuition. So the president of the place got to the bishop, and the bishop wrote to Rome and set the case formally before him. He said, if we want these institutions, we must be able to charge tuition until things get better. You're relieved now, until things get better. Rome, the Holy See, wrote back about a 4-line statement, affirmative. That often enough replies come back just like that. Not reasons, but affirmative. Yes, you can charge tuition until things get better. We're still working on the things getting better. But it's that particular document upon which all of the Jesuit schools throughout all of the world since 1832 have relied for the canonical, the church ability to charge tuition. That school happened to be St. Louis University, off on the frontier. With the continuing rise of emigration to this country, with the rise in socioeconomic status of Catholics in this country, much changed for the people here. Do you know the 3 things, perhaps more than anything else, made it possible for Catholics to rise into the middle class in the lifetime of, well, many of you, most of you? Number 1, the GI Bill of Rights. After the Second World War, every single servicewoman and serviceman who served in the United States services had full, paid by the government, full tuition, books, subsidy. There were all kinds of people who would never have had an education, never have had an opportunity. Catholics were in the lower middle class at the best. That, first of all, they got that. Secondly, 40-year mortgages for building houses, for buying land and building houses at 4%. Extraordinary, absolutely extraordinary at the time. And third, something you'd never think of, the interstate highway system. Because once that was built, acres of places from which many of you as students probably came, all of this land outside the cities suddenly became available. You could get to those places on the highways which had never been before. And all of the suburban building after the Second World War, after the 1950s, was mainly because of the interstate highway system. Those 3 together made a difference in the Catholics in this country becoming middle class, by far. As the First World War ended and communism took place over in Russia, and some years later, Nazism in Germany and fascism in Italy, the church was put under immense pressure. And even before that, as far as communism goes, in the 19th century, with the rise of the Industrial Revolution and people crowded into the cities working hideous hours, what was the legal minimum age at which a child could be employed in a mine in the 19th century in England? Anybody want to guess? 10. And they were cheaper than mules or donkeys because they were smaller and they could haul carts that the donkeys couldn't get into. That's only one example of what happened with the Industrial Revolution. And with that, a gradual rise in the appreciation on the part of the church that serious social concerns needed to be also the serious social concerns of the church. It took a long time for us to come well aware of that. Although, if you read a lot sooner than a lot of other people, if you read to some of our legislators today, Rerum Novarum, published in 1883, encyclical of Pope Leo XIII on the condition of labor, you would be called a communist. As, for example, what's his name, Rush Limbaugh has called the present Pope a communist, because he says there are inequities in the economic system today. It took us a long time to get to the awareness that there were such problems. When the Society of Jesus, after the Second World War, grew extraordinarily large in this country, especially with all of its circumstances and situations, it was still basically fairly conservative. Not as conservative as Europe, because we had to deal with situations which were different here. But then came along the event that was the most earth-shaking thing that's happened in the Catholic Church since the Council of Trent, way back in the 1500s, Vatican II. Most of you here have no idea what an epoch-making that particular meeting was, where it put the church not against the world around us, but the church in the service of the world around us. Just a simple statement such as, the church not only has the responsibility to teach the world, it has the responsibility to listen to the world. It's never said that kind of a thing before. It had never said before that there were in other religions, Christian religions, good things that portrayed, or rather preached the gospel and helped bring people to salvation. It attempted to get rid of the terrible anti-Semitism that had existed in a lot of society and a certain amount in the church as such. It made Scripture the center of where God's revelation came from. And the one thing that more than anything else, those of you who are young wouldn't have recognized this at all, the liturgy, that is the way Mass was celebrated, was the thing that most struck people as a change in the church, because week after week, Sunday after Sunday, you went to Mass now, no longer with everything in Latin, no longer with the priest facing the altar and you everywhere behind him, and his saying the prayers of the Mass in a low voice, but facing you, asking for your responses in your own language. I then mention all of those because without the changes of Vatican II, the Society of Jesus would not have changed. This Vatican II opened the possibility for the society to look at itself seriously in all the changes that had taken place and ask itself, what should we be doing? What fundamentally is the purpose of the Society of Jesus? It said at that 31st, what they call 31st General Congregation, back in 65, 66, the mission of the Society of Jesus is the service of faith. Notice what's first, the service of faith, God's revelation, the service of faith and the promotion of justice. The service of faith and the promotion of justice. All hell broke loose from that. The general of the society at the time said, that was at the 32nd, congregation, he said, if we pass this decree, this legislation, we will pay with our lives for it. And it's undoubtedly true since that time, 74, 75 Jesuits have in one place or another been killed for the promotion of that kind of justice. And also for the preaching of the faith in ways that are comprehensible to people today. The Society of Jesus renewed itself as to what it really was about with those several meetings after Vatican II. First of all, it was meant to go, as originally meant to go, to people who were on the edges of society. At the time of St. Ignatius, that was certainly true, as it's meant to go to people also on the edges of society today. It was meant to be serious about the academic and the intellectual life, and we started schools, but it was also meant to be serious in that academic and intellectual life about theology, about contemporary theology, about how theology tries to answer the real questions of real people today in terms that they can really understand. The society, in some senses, reinvented itself within its own community lives by being much more communal, in which we discussed things, and it was not just the superior saying such, and such, which we discussed things, which we came to consensus through discernment and through communal discussions. The Society of Jesus reinvented itself in some ways within its own internal life by also taking on an external life too, by taking on jobs and tasks that other people were not taking on. One of the early Jesuits said the point of the Society of Jesus is to go to those places and go to those places where others do not go and take on those tasks which others have not taken on. Whether we've done that very well or not is another question. But you can't understand the present society unless you know something about that background that shaped us and the church through the 19th century. And I could go on for a lot longer. I'm going to quit in just a few moments. I could go on a lot longer about what shaped us since Vatican II. We're not comprehensible unless we have done that. I think what the Society of Jesus has done for itself is not only restored itself in the 1814, it has renewed itself in the kind of schools it has, not only Wheeling, but schools all over the world. Schools for the much poorer people than you are, much more dispossessed people than you are. The preaching of the exercises, much more widespread to individuals than we ever did it before. Much more we are on the missions again, and the farthest out, different missions. That's what it means to talk about the renewal of the society. Whether we've done it always very well, I don't know. You, in some ways, you have to judge that at least as much as we judge ourselves. As I come to the end of this talk, I want you to think about what you think the Society of Jesus ought to be. And talk to the Jesuits here. See what you think they ought to be. Of course, then maybe we ought to listen to the Jesuits and let them tell you what they think you who are students here, anyway, they tell you, but much more by the example they teach you, what they think you ought to be. So, both restoration of the society and renewal of the society, but renewal of all of our works, renewal of what we're doing and how we're doing it, and ideally, renewal of each one of us, men and women, lay and religious and clergy, from Pope Francis on up or down the line, and he would say from him on up the line, as the humble man he is. That's what the Society of Jesus is about today. I hope it's given you some sense of where we've come from and what we hope to do with your help. Thank you.
We have time for any questions, anything come to mind while Father was speaking. And he's receptive to anything. So take it away, John, and just call whoever might raise their hand.
Yes.
Thank you for that,
You're
especially
welcome.
following one thread for 150 years or so. That was wonderfully done. I was curious about the election of Clement XIV, and the way you described it made it sound like the Jesuit problem was the dominant discussion at the conclave.
It was.
So what else was going on?
Nothing.
Nothing. Okay.
Nothing.
All right.
Nothing. It was the dominant problem because all of the Catholic powers of Europe made it the dominant problem. They discussed nothing else.
Okay. Thank you.
Now that may strike you as strange. It was strange, but it was it was sitting there, the elephant in the room. Yes.
I'm just curious through, is it only the Jesuits who have been suppressed, or, have we suppressed other orders?
Oh, all kinds of orders have been suppressed in the past, usually smaller ones, and usually after they've become so small or so out of tune with what they ought to be doing, when they've lost their original, that blessed word, their original charism, they have been suppressed. But it's none of the major orders, the larger ones, Jesuits, Franciscans, Dominicans, Benedictines, those are the four largest old orders. Most of the religious congregations, men and women, that have ever existed in the church no longer exist. Not because they've been suppressed, but because they simply go out of existence. They gradually lose, they diminish in numbers until there are no more. But that's happened. None has been, oh yes, was one that was suppressed far more brutally than the Society of Jesus. Although the general of the Society of Jesus, a really holy and good man, Lorenzo Ricci, was imprisoned at the insistence of the Catholic kings. He was imprisoned in Castel Sant'Angelo, that big round building a little ways from St. Peter's. He was imprisoned there for almost 2 years until he died there. To him did not happen what happened to the Superior General of the Knights Templar back in the middle-aged medieval period at the insistence of the King of France. He was accused of heresy and burned at the stake and he certainly wasn't guilty of that, when the Templars were completely suppressed. That was, in some ways, by far the most unjust, again, at the insistence of one of the rulers. Other questions? Yes?
Father, you used some very graphic adjectives to describe how they were describing the Jesuits when they were trying to boot them out. What made them think that the Jesuits were using witchcraft
Oh, yes.
such? I mean, what were they, did they name concrete things that the Jesuits were doing?
No, not that particular document, no. I mean, some of you are old enough to, well, none of you are old enough to remember the Red Scare phase of American political society right after the First World War. But some of you may be old enough to remember the McCarthy situation, and where there were communists under every bed. And you couldn't persuade people that that wasn't the case. The American government was riddled by communists. They were going to take over soon. That's a minor kind of comparison to the pamphlet war that was waged against the Jesuits at this time. One of the first examples of real pamphlet war was the stuff that was put out about the Jesuits in the 18th century. If you say it often enough, people are going to believe it. But they did not practice astrology. They did not practice witchcraft. Well, here, let me give you an example of the kind of nonsense, much more recent, close to our times. In the 1850s in the United States, you ever heard of the American Protective Association? It was an association to protect real, genuine Americans, the Anglo-Saxon race, against this mongrel group of Irish and Germans and Poles and so on coming to the United States. It was also known as the Know-Nothings, the Know-Nothing Society, because when they were asked, they would say, "I know nothing." They elected several people to the legislatures in a variety of states, and at least one state had a governor who was know-nothing. They were very anti-Catholic. The example was the Jesuits were being accused at St. Louis University of engaging in abominable practices in the basement of one of their buildings. What it probably was St. Louis U had a medical school, at the time, the first Jesuit medical school. All lay people, Jesuits weren't the doctors, the dean was a layman, the faculty were lay, and they were practicing dissection in the dissection room of the medical school. But the Know-Nothings pushed that so loudly and so strongly in St. Louis that the university and the medical school had to separate completely in order to save both of them. Interestingly, the medical school, St. Louis U bought a functioning medical school back in 1905 and reintegrated, started it again. But the original St. Louis U Medical School became the medical school of Washington University in St. Louis. But that was absolute, you had mobs attempting to burn down various, well, the convents in Charleston, Massachusetts was burned down by a mob. A mob did pretty much the same kind of thing in Philadelphia. We have no idea of how bitterly anti-Catholic people were in this country at one time. You know, of course, that under colonial times, if a Jesuit were caught in Massachusetts, he was to be exiled. If he were caught a second time, unless he were tossed up in a shipwreck, or unless he had come as one of the members of a foreign delegation, unless those two, if he were caught a second time, he was to be hanged. There was only one state, before the American government, before the American Constitution, the Declaration of Independence and the Declaration, there was only one state in the United States in which priests were legal: Pennsylvania. Maryland had started with the toleration. The Virginians invaded Maryland and took over and installed a Protestant government. And while de facto Catholics continue to exist in Maryland, in fact, Charles Carroll became one of the richest people in the colonies, a Catholic at the time. As long as they kept a low profile, they were okay. But you were formally forbidden so to be. You can't imagine that. Most of the priests in the colonies, well, they managed to, after the society was suppressed, the Jesuits who had worked in Maryland down on the farms in the rural Maryland, and they had come to this country in 1634 when Maryland was founded by a Catholic proprietor colonist, Charles Calvert, Lord Baltimore. That's when they had come there. They stayed working down there through all these years, and then founded a church in Philadelphia, Old St. Joseph's in Willings Alley. But legally, they were allowed only in Massachusetts until the Declaration of Independence. As one of the rather major American historians has said, the second greatest prejudice in the United States through all of the 19th century after racism against the blacks was anti-Catholicism. We haven't grown up with that, finally. We don't even remember any of that. Does that somewhat answer your question?
Thank you.
Yes.
Well, thanks for being here tonight. It's been very interesting. You mentioned Rerum Novarum, and it seems in that document there was a solution by Leo XIII that workers should have not only a just wage, but share in the means of production.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the ways that can be accomplished, some believe, in current day life is through the use of ESOPs, where the workers also get to own some of the shared stock.
Yeah.
I wonder if in any of the 28 Jesuit institutions, if there is a teaching of that or a following of that.
I simply don't know, but I'd be very surprised if there weren't in the schools of business administration or public policy. I would be very surprised. One other way in which that is done is what they call something like the Common Council in Germany. In Germany, you know, it's a good example of extraordinarily great productivity and prosperity. Both workers and management serve on a common council in the organization or in the enterprise, whatever the company is, and both workers and the management both have votes on fundamental things. That's almost impossible at the moment in the United States. But what did you call it? ESOP, ESOP, yeah.
Employee stock
Yeah,
ownership.
stock ownership, yeah. It strikes me that nobody would have thought about that at the time of Leo XIII. But I frankly think it's a pretty good idea. There's nothing that makes people more concerned about property than if they own some. And that's one of the things that's made this country, not only this country, but most of the European countries and this country, relatively stable with their governments. Not the only thing by any means, but if you've got a stake in the productivity and the reasonably decent life that it brings, you're going to be somewhat more reluctant to take violent measures. That's not the only thing by any means. Europe and most of Europe and the United States are exceptions to the unfortunate way in which governments come and go. And when people get desperate enough, they will revolt. They will. And one of the best things that people who don't want revolutions is to see that people do have decent wages, decent lives, and decent prospects for the future, especially for the future. Other questions? Thank you. Yes, right here.
I know you said this is something that you could speak about at length.
Don't tempt me.
Well, I was gonna say, if you were to choose the one or two, you said that you could talk about the things that have influenced and shaped the Jesuits since Vatican II. If you were to choose the maybe one or two or so most important, like decisive things that have brought the Jesuits from the 1960s to today, how would you identify those?
A greater openness to the world that followed upon Vatican II's greater openness to the world. We always got into trouble by being too much worldly. That is to say, we were concerned about ships and tacks and sealing wax and cabbages and kings. You know, we were concerned about everyday ordinary things. And sometimes have we gone to excess on that? Yes. But with the church concerned about the way in which people live and the way in which the world in which we live makes a difference to the way in which we believe and pray, that more than anything else, I think, pushed or propelled or urged the society to an even greater concern for how the world works. And world is an abstract, you know, how the world works, how men and women in wherever they're living, whether they're living in a jungle in Guatemala, or they're living in the Congo, or they're living in the United States, or they're living in Canada. How do they live? How does the way they live and think make a difference in the way in which they see their relationship to God? I guess maybe, if you want one simple phrase, I shouldn't do this because it just came to me, but the awareness that God is at work in the world. And if God is at work in the world, should we not also be? Now, I don't want to turn the Society of Jesus into simply a social work organization by any means, but we ought to be much more socially inclined to the social implications of what we do and say, how we pray, how we work with people, how we teach, how we govern ourselves. I think that perhaps, now that was in some senses off the top of my head, but you know, Jesuits always improvise. Other questions? Well, thank you very much for listening to me.
Before we